Morning to everyone here in the Western Hemisphere. Good day, good evening to everyone in the Eastern Hemisphere. I'm Ken Pollock. I am the Vice President for Policy here at the Middle East Institute, and welcome to another of our update briefings on the current war between Israel and Iran. Um, a notice to all who are tuning in, we are on the record today. You're welcome to use everything that we say. A recording will be posted later on the web for others who'd like to watch it, and those of you who miss parts of it and like to go back to it, welcome to do so. We'll also be taking questions later on. We'll start out with some opening statements, but after that, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so through the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. If you're not familiar with that, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will find a Q&A button between the share button, which is probably bright green, and the show captions button. If you click on that, it'll bring up a dialog box. You can write your question into the dialog box, and then I will work those questions in, ask any of us to respond to them as we go along. So please do use the Q&A function down there. With that, as many of you who have, I think all of you who have been to these webinars before know, I'm not big on introductions because they take time away from actually getting to the heart of the issue. And of course, we now have the internet, so if you want to know anything about any of us, you can look it up very easily. I'm joined today by terrific speakers. Colby Connelly, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in energy and oil affairs, and Major General Scott Benedict, who is a former U.S. Marine, long service both in the Middle East and elsewhere for the United States of America. And General Benedict is also one of MEI's distinguished military fellows. Colby, Scott, welcome. Let's start with just 7 or 8 remarks. What have you guys been keeping tabs on? What do you think has been going on that's interesting? What do you think people should know about? General, why don't you start us off?
Well, thanks, Ken. And it's great to be able to participate in this. And I really appreciate MEI putting on these type of events. One of the things that I've been really encouraged about, even as I was preparing to join you today, is the level of sophistication in the reporting on what's going on in the theater. And this is a wide range of things that's inside the papers, on the news, coming out of places like the Middle East Institute. Tremendous resources have been available to the public to understand what is going on. So really appreciate that. What I'll try to do today is just talk a little bit about what the perspective might be from a military planner as they're approaching the problems associated with the region, with the engagement between the Israelis and the Iranians. I'm not talking to anybody directly inside government about any type of information, and I just caveat that all these opinions are my own. The two things I would kind of bring up that come off the top of my head, or a few things right up front, is I'm not so sure that we've seen as much reporting as I would have expected on the ability of the Iranians, or excuse me, the ability of the Israelis to take down the Iranian air defenses. I mean, this is really amazing what they've been able to do. There's daytime flights occurring over Tehran today. That's not something that we would have expected as quickly as this has happened. Understanding some of this happened a little bit earlier in April, some of the initial strikes and actions against their air defenses. But the fact that they've gotten themselves into this situation now where they're effectively acting with air superiority over the country of Iran is really unprecedented, I think. And I think there's going to be a lot that we'll be able to learn about the combined arms effects that they did in order to get themselves into this situation. It's equivalent to what we would be expecting from our U.S. Air Force and our other air capabilities. I've been really impressed by that. What I would also say, though, despite the fact that they've had incredible successes, my sense is that the amount of destruction that they've been able to do against the nuclear program, to include even the scientists that they've been able to prevent from continuing to work, it's not going to be enough to prevent the Iranians from continuing this work if that's what they decide to do. They've got the knowledge now, and they understand what they need to do and how they need to do it. And while we would expect that the destruction of the infrastructure will continue to happen, I don't expect that simple strikes alone are going to stop the Iranians from developing their nuclear program if that's what they continue to choose to do. It will only delay it. And what I would say is I kind of think about the Israelis' theory of victory here. I see this much more as a disruptive theory of victory as opposed to a attrition. We're going to see the strikes continue on the infrastructure, both critical national infrastructure as well as the nuclear. But what we're really seeing is a combined set of effects that tend to paralyze the enemy, break down their military will, and then also, I think, the intent of the Israelis to break down their political will so that they can get them back to a situation where negotiations can occur and they can hopefully get a peaceful resolution to this nuclear the nuclear pursuit that the Iranians have been on. The second big point that I like to make is about the Iranian nuclear program and what they do with their nuclear program and how they implement that, certainly internationally. It's always been the perspective of the team down at CENTCOM, certainly when I was there, that the Iranians use their nuclear program to negotiate. They use their ballistic missiles and their proxies to extend their power inside the region and threaten their neighbors. They use the negotiations on the nuclear in order to relieve sanctions, relieve pressure on their government, enable them to do things that they would like to do, certainly earning more resources, money, in order to pursue their other ends. So anytime that anybody ever talked about their ballistic missile capability and restricting it, that was an immediate red line for the Iranians. Whereas the nuclear, that was an opportunity to talk. So while I think that the actions that the Israelis have been able to take up to now have been extremely effective at reducing their capabilities, I also think that we're going to start to see a slowdown in the attacks, and a lot of that has already been reported. But there's a point at which the Iranians are going to need to keep some type of strategic reserve of conventional ballistic missiles because they're going to want to maintain the ability to deter as well as threaten their neighbors and really have the opportunity to bring some force into the negotiations and try to get some piece of leverage and whoever they ended up negotiating with in the long run. So I think I'll stop there. So really, again, two big things. One is the speed at which the Israelis were able to take down the air defenses. And then the second piece is what's the real purpose here of the Iranians with the nuclear program and then also with their conventional ballistic missile program. Thanks.
Those are great points, General. I really appreciate those. All right, Colby, why don't you go next and let's start to talk about the energy piece of all of this.
Sure, thanks, Ken. So I'll just give sort of a brief lay of the land for where things are since the conflict has gotten going and taken place with a couple of overarching points. The first of which is that the market is really still grasping for certainty around this situation. And you've seen that reflected in the movement of benchmark oil prices since then. Over the past few days that this conflict has been going on, there's definitely been a very intense effort to determine whether definitively this will lead to a major oil and gas supply disruption. And at this juncture, the reality is we're really no closer to a definitive answer about that than we were when things got started. It feels more imminent than it did during the initial discussion that we had last Friday, but the kind of clarity that the market is searching for in order to price this in and in order for different players in the market to try to readjust just isn't there yet. You just simply can't react to something that hasn't taken place. That said, I am really approaching this situation with the mindset that just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean we aren't closer than ever to this type of disruption that has been on the books in theory forever taking place, and the market is going to continue reacting to this drip feed of information until it gets something much more definitive. Until then, we're probably going to stay anchored in this $70-$75 per barrel range with fluctuations depending on the headlines. And if you look at where Brent has been trading today, everyone's clearly pretty nervous. But there is a caveat there. It's also important to remember that when you're looking at the price, and some people are wondering why it's not higher. Since October 2023, a lot of people in the market have consistently overestimated supply risks from the Middle East, and there have been a lot of people that have been burned by that miscalculation. So I think the relatively muted price level is partly reflective of that experience. It's not the entire explanation. This was a weaker year for the demand outlook anyway. OPEC Plus had been bringing a lot of supply back to market. But the idea that oil should be higher than where it is now is at least partly informed by previous reactions that didn't eventually get the actual physical supply loss that they were expecting. And that really sort of brings me to my second point, which is that even if we engage in this debate of will we or will we not see an actual disruption, a major part of the uncertainty is that we still don't know what a real disruption in the Gulf or in its periphery could actually look like. There are a lot of different ways that could play out depending on the way things go with the conflict itself, and the answer to that is going to come from the military realm before it comes from the energy sector. There are a couple of different types of disruption to potentially consider here because they would have different implications depending on exactly how they take place. And the first, of course, is a direct Iranian attempt to disrupt maritime traffic through the Strait or its periphery, either in the Gulf or in the Gulf of Oman, with energy shipping likely to be their primary target. It's possible you saw some of how that might happen take place in 2019 in the run up to the OPEC attack. Uh, Overall, I think I'd leave the specifics of how some of this might play out to folks like yourself and the general who are more military experts. But I think to some extent, all I would say here is that it's worth noting that in some instances, either deterrence or just the risk can be as powerful as certain actions, whether they're limited or not. And either you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but I was going through statements from the Houthis in Yemen last night, and they never formally said they were going to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They just made everyone too afraid to use it. And the risk tolerance, I think, with the Gulf will be higher due to the lack of alternatives, given that everyone was able to essentially reroute things around the southern coast of the African continent. With the Gulf, you've got overland pipelines in a couple of places, but overall, there are no alternatives really for the totality of the supply that comes out of the Gulf. And actually, if we talk about LNG, which isn't really getting mentioned enough, there are no alternatives. And you're seeing some of that hesitancy from Qatar as well, with Qatar Energy making it official yesterday and advising vessels that are heading for its terminals to actually wait outside the Gulf until the day before their scheduled loading. So you've got a buildup of different types of vessels in the Gulf of Oman outside the Strait as a result of that. And there are going to be other risks that are sort of compounded by that situation. One of them was seen, I think, sort of off the coast of Fujairah yesterday with the two tankers that collided there. And what's exacerbating things in this situation is the proliferation of what gets called the dark fleet and the gray fleet since 2022. And when that became a big subterfuge for Russia to avoid sanctions, which is something Iran obviously takes part in as well. But one of those two vessels in the collision yesterday was a dark tanker. And while I haven't seen any direct confirmation of whether or not this was the cause, part of one of the favored methods of the gray and dark fleet is turning off the AIS system, to limit their electronic visibility, and that just highlights how a lot of these risks in the area can really build up when there's a major disruption or a threat of one. We're starting to see this kind of ripple effect. The second and really third points on the scenarios themselves are kind of revolving around exactly where a supply disruption at the point of production or export might take place, because that could unfold really in two major ways, in two major categories that would probably wouldn't evolve neatly along those lines. But The first could be the loss of Iranian supply, potentially following an Israeli strike against export facilities, or some sort of action to limit Iranian exports, which, by the way, since the conflict started, have risen to an all-time high. So there's clearly a concern from Iran about potentially being limited. And then, of course, the second possibility would be an Iranian strike on oil infrastructure elsewhere, potentially echoing something like we saw in 2019 in OPEC. But there's no certainty around where that would happen, what the damage as a result of it taking place would be, and what the volume and duration of the outage would be. It's worth repeating what we discussed previously the last time we met for one of these calls, which is that over 80% of OPEC plus spare capacity is located within the Gulf. That's an enormous risk factor here, but it does also sort of highlight that if a real disruption does occur, there is, in theory, capacity in the region to try and offset the loss, depending on what it looks like. If the world loses access to the totality of supply that comes out of the Gulf, that's where there's a really catastrophic scenario, because then that OPEC plus spare capacity counts for nothing. You can't replace supply with additional capacity from a place where you've already lost it. But absent that outcome, which I think we'd all agree is really the worst case scenario, and maybe one of the least likely at this point, there is an ability among OPEC plus to respond to that kind of a loss. They won't do it on the back of higher prices, which is basically just a geopolitical risk premium, and there's no certainty as to how long that'll last. They're very explicit about that. That's not something that they respond to. It might create difficulties if you were, for instance, to lose Iranian supply, especially as the result of a direct attack, just because pretty much everyone in the Gulf is an OPEC member. Iran is an OPEC member, and there are hesitancies in the past to step in and kind of capture market share from a member that lost it. I think this situation might probably give way to some different thinking there, but the space to act would be there with some of those considerations in mind. And then, a little bit more quickly, I think the third and final point that I would make is that in the region itself, some of the impacts on energy are already being felt, aside from which I think was one of the largest ones or most significant ones, which was the Israeli attack on South Pars facilities. But Israel itself did shut down production at the Leviathan field, which is its largest offshore gas field. That has directly impacted Egypt, which has lost around 1 billion cubic feet a day in gas imports. Egypt is a very, very supply constrained country. They're very, very dependent on those imports from Israel, and so key industries like fertilizer production have had to start shutting down. Um, you know, Egypt can get more supply. They have the ability to import LNG. This is a year when they're already talking about importing 120 cargoes or more, which is remarkable for a country that used to be a net exporter. But that does have the knockoff effect then on the gas market if Egypt has to potentially absorb some more cargoes that it previously would have turned to Israeli supply for. And in addition to that, you also are seeing a risk premium in gas markets, with the Dutch TTF benchmark up about 15% since June 10th. So the energy impact is there. It's growing. We're not at the worst case scenario yet, but that's, I think, kind of the 30,000 foot perspective on the state of play since things got started on the 13th.
That's great, Colby. All right, I'm going to use my introductory remarks to pick up on where General Benedict left us, because I think that the points that he was getting at are hugely important. I am complete agreement with the points that he made. And of course, this is really the elephant in the room at the moment. And so I'd like to confront it directly, and that is this question of American participation in the war. And what I wanted to do is I simply wanted to lay out the considerations on both sides, because you've had already all kinds of arguments being made very loudly by both sides in this. And what I will say is that both sides have a lot of very good points. That's the problem. Right. But I'd like to start where General Benedict left off, because, again, I think he was exactly right in putting these issues on the table. It's always important to remember that the purpose of a war is not to defeat your enemy. The purpose of a war is to create better conditions at the end of the war, which usually requires you to defeat your enemy, although not always. We can all point to historical examples where even that wasn't necessary. Typically it does, but it's only one part of it. And we should also remember that there are any number of wars, including wars waged by the United States, where we did a brilliant job defeating our enemy, only to fail to secure a better set of circumstances afterwards. Right now, what we're seeing is, the Israelis doing what they typically do, which is in most of their wars, they are tactically brilliant, right? They are brilliant at the tactical aspects of defeating your enemy. But what we've also seen from Israel in the past is that they too cannot always convert that into better circumstances down the road. I am old enough to remember the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. The initial military campaign, again, was brilliant. 6 years earlier, the Syrian army had invaded Lebanon and immediately got stuck, bogged down, bloodied, and beaten by the PLO in the mountains of Lebanon. The Israelis pushed through the PLO like a hot knife through butter, and they were on the outskirts of Beirut in a matter of days. Again, it was a brilliant military operation. But I think you all know that did not end well for Israel. Right? Strategically, that operation turned into a nightmare for the Israelis. And they were only able to extract themselves in 2000. Now, that's not to say that this is guaranteed to be the same, but we need to recognize, we need to separate the brilliance of Israel's tactical operations so far, which are all about ultimately defeating its adversary. General Benedict commented on that, how well they're doing in terms of air defense, right? They are very good at this, and we can all marvel at the things that they are able to do. I mean, my God, setting up a drone base inside Iran, it is absolutely remarkable, but we need to recognize that that does not necessarily translate into strategic victory, especially over the long term. And from my perspective, I think from everyone's, General Benedict was alluding to this as well, that is really going to be determined by whether 3, 5, 10 years from now, Iran has nuclear weapons, or I should say, this regime, this Iranian regime has nuclear weapons. That will be the ultimate determinative of whether or not we code this war as having been a victory or ultimately a strategic failure. And we also need to recognize that where things stand right now, it still could go either way, again, exactly as General Benedict pointed out. Many of you have heard me say before, I'll make the point again, Israel has tried on numerous occasions to prevent other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. It has had mixed results there, right? Where it has succeeded, in fact, has often been the result of factors beyond its control. The example that I think is most relevant and I cite most often is the 1981 Osirak strike against the Iraqi nuclear reactor, which at the time everyone believed, again, brilliant Israeli military operation, obliterated the Iraqi nuclear reactor, which was the heart of its nuclear program at the moment. Everyone believed that in doing so, Israel had saved the world from the threat of Saddam Hussein with a nuclear weapon. And what we found out after the Gulf War and the US invasion of Iraq was instead that Saddam was so infuriated, so enraged by the Israeli strike that he doubled and tripled down on his nuclear program. His nuclear program made far greater progress after the Israeli strike than had been the case beforehand. And we were simply fortunate that he was stupid enough to invade Kuwait before he had a nuclear weapon, which he probably would have had between 1992 and 1995. Thankfully, he didn't wait, and the United States stripped him of that capability along with our coalition allies during the Gulf War. So this is the great danger out there, exactly as General Benedict pointed out, which is at the end of this and going on into the future, does the Iranian regime, first, is it still in place? And second, does it make the decision that it now must have a nuclear weapon, that it is going to pour resources into its nuclear program, and that it will dare the United States, Israel, and everyone else to stop it from acquiring one? As General Benedict pointed out, they have the know-how. They know how to do all of this stuff. And, even if you take all of the physical attributes, the facilities away from them, they will be able to rebuild should they choose to do so. And it will be quite difficult to keep preventing them from reconstituting their nuclear program should they choose to do so. So, in terms of American intervention, again, everyone is focused on the Fordo complex. They're right to do so. Fordo is a very big issue out there. And I will simply say that I had a senior serving Israeli military officer say to me over the weekend, if this war ends and the Fordo facility is still functional, we will have failed to achieve our objectives. Right? It just speaks to how important Fordo is in this whole complex for Iran and for what Israel is trying to achieve. It suggests that the Israelis went into this war with some kind of a plan for Fordo, some way of dealing with it. And that may be airstrikes, although again, I think that people are mistaken to simply focus on airstrikes as the only way that Israel could deal with the Fordo complex. There are other ways that it could do so. One we need to acknowledge is that they might have been thinking all along, we can drag the Americans into this and have the Americans take care of Fordo. I think that would be a fundamentally irresponsible way of conducting operations, but we obviously can't rule it out. But even beyond Fordo, again, the real question mark out there is Iranian reconstitution. And one can absolutely make the argument that American participation in this war is not only more likely to obliterate all of Iran's existing capability, but it might bring about the fall of the regime, right? Probably more likely than pure Israeli um, operations. And beyond that, it might be enough to convince the Iranian regime that they shouldn't reconstitute. That if the United States is actively involved, it demonstrates that the U.S. is willing to use force to prevent Iran from reconstituting, and therefore it would be a bad idea for the Iranians to try to do so in the future. But the other hand is also equally important, right? A big piece of this is if the United States gets involved, first in the short term, will the Iranian leadership fear that this now is a regime change war? Will they fear that the United States is coming into it to change the regime? Will they know if the United States tries to avoid creating that impression? I would actually argue that the Israelis, contrary to what a lot of people are saying, Israeli targeting, I think, has been very clearly designed to reinforce to Iran's political leadership that they're not trying for regime change. I think that if it happens, that's great. But if they were trying for regime change, they would be going after Iran's political leaders. They have scrupulously avoided doing so. They go after military leaders. They're going after weapons scientists. They have not been going after Iran's political leaders. There are lots of them. And I think we all have to assume that Israel could just as easily kill them as it has killed Iran's military leaders and weapons scientists. Right? This, I think, is very clearly a sign to the Iranians that we're not going after your leaders, because I think they are hoping that after the war is over, during it, that they will be able to convince the Iranians not to make a breakout for a nuclear weapon by being able to threaten, we will go after your political leaders should we choose to do so. Well, if the US comes in, I think that Iran will have a much harder time knowing whether or not we are looking for regime change and whether it may happen anyway, because of the impact of American military participation. I think that it could frighten the Iranian leadership. I think that it may confuse them. We have to recognize that there would be a greater likelihood of a much bigger Iranian response should they do so. In addition, the Israelis simply do not have the capability to do more than airstrikes and very limited special forces operations against Iran. The United States has much greater military capacity. And should we get involved in this war, and should the Iranians come out of it declaring that they are now absolutely going to acquire nuclear weapons because they believe it's the only way to deter us from future operations against them, and then they dare us and the Israelis to stop them, will the United States feel pressured to get more and more deeply into the war? The problem is ultimately what this creates is a circumstance where the United States and the Israelis are trying to coerce the Iranian regime into not rebuilding its its nuclear program. And coercion is very hard to do through air power alone. Lots of countries have tried. Some have had some success, but it's been at best a very mixed record. And the danger would be that having committed ourselves to this and having provoked the Iranians to saying we are absolutely going to acquire nuclear weapons, will the United States feel itself dragged down an escalatory path to try to prevent Iran from acquiring that nuclear weapon? And that escalatory path is very, very hard to predict where it would end. So as I said, there are rationales on both sides. American intervention is much more likely to prevent Iran, well, it's much more likely to destroy Iran's extant nuclear capabilities. And there's very much an argument that it could also help prevent the Iranians from choosing to reconstitute. But it could also work in the opposite direction. And the problem here, as with all coercive military operations, is it's ultimately up to your adversary to decide how they're going to proceed, how much pain they're willing to tolerate, and what they think is the best response to the coercion itself. Okay, let's open things up to questions. We've already got some really good ones out there. General, I'm going to start with you because you already touched on this already. We've got a really good question about munitions, about missiles. You touched briefly on Iran, its ability to continue to retaliate, the sense that there is diminishing retaliation on their part. If you could unpack that a little bit, but also talk about the Israeli side. Is there danger that the Israelis are going to run out of ballistic missile interceptors, some of the long-range munitions that they've been using against Iran? Could this war drag to an end because both sides start running out of munitions? Or, as you were starting to suggest before, to what extent could it really change perhaps Iranian strategy or even Israeli strategy because of the potential shortages of munitions?
Yes, yes to both. I think so. I think the interesting thing about so I'll start with the Iranians. I think the interesting thing about the approach that the Israelis have taken or the IDF has taken is they're essentially burning the candle on both ends. So if there was a fixed number, and I've seen the number 2,000, I know it's in the thousands of short, medium, long range missile capabilities. But if the Iranians are shooting a certain number of missiles to have an effect, and they have to try to oversaturate the Israeli defenses so that they can get anything through, because the Israeli defenses are pretty effective. So they had to start with these very large barrages, like we saw back in April, like we've seen in the first couple nights of this attack. They're firing their capability. But at the same time, the Israelis are destroying the launchers, and they're also destroying some of the storage sites. And so there's a lot more missiles than there are launchers. And then, of course, if you don't have a launcher, you can't launch the missile. And production facility capability to replenish. And so that's what I mean by they're burning them on both ends. So it's a non-linear look at this, because it isn't just what they're firing; it's that they're also being attrited at the same time, and the launch capability and the production capability is being attrited at the same time. I think the Israelis, they have some challenges too. So they really have three systems, as I'm sure most are aware of on the call. But the Iron Dome system really effective at shooting rockets and sort of small type munitions, drones that are coming from mostly from Gaza, potentially Lebanon. Very good kind of low altitude capability. And then they also had the David Sling, and then they also had the Arrow capability. And the Arrow's missiles alone, I've seen reports that are $3 million just for an Arrow missile. So magazine depth is definitely an issue. There's no question about it. And of course, they have some Patriot and they have some THAAD for from some of the high altitude, and the United States provides some assistance, and as well as we've seen partners and allies in the region are helping out. I think when we start to see a big tip towards more drones coming out of Iran and less missiles, that's when we're going to see the Iranians are starting to think about how many missiles do they need to keep in their strategic reserve. So ideally, that time comes at an equal intersection. So Israel continues to maintain level of defensive capabilities over their critical infrastructure, as well as their large civilian populations. At the same time, the Iranians are shooting less missiles because they're trying to preserve that capability for some point in the future, either negotiations or some type of deterrent capability that they're going to want to maintain. So I think that's probably an answer. The big one is they're burning the candle at both ends in Iran, where the Israelis are helping them burn one end of the candle while they have lit the other end. And then the Israelis also need to be concerned about this. And what we've seen too in Ukraine fight, when we start looking at American countries and their ability to produce these missiles, it's not World War II where they're rolling off the assembly lines. These are very complex. There hasn't been a large demand over the years to keep those magazines built up, and they're very expensive. So very hard to sort of get that industrial base cranking in order to meet the type of timelines that we're talking about here to replenish on the Israeli side the air defense capabilities.
That's great, General. Okay, I want to ask Colby a question, and then, General, I'm going to come back to you with a kind of follow-up based on the same issue. Colby, what I want to put to you is one of the questions we've got, actually, we've got several around this, but one specifically on this, which is Karg Island, right? You kind of alluded to this a little bit, but let's talk about it a little bit more. Explain to everyone on the call the importance of Karg to the Iranian system, the Iranian, that is, hydrocarbon system, what it represents, and also, its size, the extent of, the difficulty of attacking this thing. And then, General, I'd love to come back to you and ask that question about, your sense of Israel. Obviously, we can obliterate the thing, but, your sense of Israel's ability to deal with a big, complex target like Karg, especially being so far away from Israel. So, Colby, first tell us about Karg and why it's important.
Sure. So Karg Island is where the majority of Iranian oil exports come from. So in a sense, it does sort of represent, in theory, a bottleneck for where Iranian barrels go if they lose access to that sort of export capacity. And as I mentioned, Iranian exports have been at an all-time high since this conflict started. They've surpassed 2 million barrels a day when they were hovering more around 1.6, 1.7 for the last several months. So there's clearly a concern about getting some of these barrels out in the event that something does happen. The implications would be that if the capacity there were lost, it's not Iran's only facility. They have another terminal just outside the strait called Jask that was built a few years ago. But most of the countries in the Gulf, Iran is not the only one, do tend to have very, very large terminals that are where exports are centered to one degree or another. If you're in Saudi Arabia, it's Ras Tanura. There are other terminals, but that's really the flagship. If you're in Iraq, it's Basra. So these kinds of infrastructure setups do represent a bottleneck if that capacity is lost, and that then limits the amount of supply that can go to market. It also could result in Iran probably having to reduce production if they're not exporting as much. Now that could, again, this is a ways off, but if they do lose a substantial amount of refining capacity, that could lead to production to shut in further and potentially reduce the amount that's available for export elsewhere. We have a long way to go before we get there. Iran has over 2 million barrels a day in refining capacity, which is very large. But the Karg Island terminal was mentioned back in October when there were thoughts that Israel might target oil installations at that time. So in a way, this is really kind of one of the biggest assets to watch to see if there will be some sort of major loss of Iranian supply. South Pars caught a lot of attention when it was attacked, but it's really more of a facility that relates to Iran's domestic gas requirements. It is very critical. But in terms of Iran's oil exports, yes, Karg Island is basically the crown jewel.
General, want to jump in on the military aspects of it?
My sense would be that Israel's demonstrated that they can reach out and touch anything that they want to reach out and touch. whether that's with direct kinetic operations or non-kinetic operations. To me, when I think about this, I think about it more in terms of what is the effect that they're trying to achieve? What effect would they be getting out of attacking Cargill? And is that really going to change any behavior? I mean, ostensibly, what the Israelis have said is that their objectives are to reduce the nuclear infrastructure and then also reduce the conventional weapons. I think what we've seen also is that, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, that they're looking for disruption. I don't know that that's necessarily meaning regime change, but what they wanted to do was paralyze the ability of the Iranians to be able to make decisions, react, respond, and demonstrate that what they have been able to do is almost complete dominance over a country that everybody thought was going to be much more difficult in order to achieve the level of effects that they've been able to achieve. So what would be the purpose of them going after those islands, and what would be the impact? And again, I think that the Israelis, if they're looking at it from their national interest, I think I think about this pretty simple. Who's watching what they're doing, and who really cares about what they're doing. And I think the Israeli government has a sacred responsibility to the Jewish people in creating a safe and secure Jewish country. That's the first thing they're doing. Then they got to worry about the United States. And what are we going to think about those things that they do? And then I think the last one is that sending a message to their adversary on what their capabilities are. And I think we particularly saw that messaging in April when they initially took out some air defense capabilities and said, look, we can reach out and touch you anywhere inside your country. And that had a deterring effect on the Iranians. I don't know what it would take or what it would do if they attacked their infrastructure. And then you go back and you look at those audiences, and is it really furthering any one of those? Is it creating a more secure Israel? Is it keeping the United States aligned with your actions and activities? And what message is it sending to your adversaries? Because the number one thing that the Iranians want to do is maintain their regime. And so now you may not be getting the behavior that you were looking for. You may be getting the behavior that you alluded to, what Saddam responded to when they attacked the nuclear facility in Iraq several years ago.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to take the next set because we've got a whole bunch of questions about regime change in Iran and what it would mean potentially, for a whole variety of different ways. And I'm going to see if I can answer a number of these questions all wrapped up. So first point, again, General Benedict's remarks are getting exactly this, and I think I alluded to it, but I'll be a little bit clearer. One of the great risks, if you want to call it that, costs, if you want to think about it that way, of pursuing deliberate regime change in Iran or taking action that will make the Iranian regime fear that we are pursuing deliberate regime change in Iran is that you are likely to get much bigger Iranian responses. They're likely to use more of the tools, more of the weapons available to them against more targets. And obviously, the scenario of Iran attacking oil exports in the Gulf, trying to close the Strait of Hormuz, right? All this stuff is most likely under circumstances where either Israel alone or the US and Israel are deliberately pursuing regime change in Iran. And again, you can make the counter argument. I think it is a very fair one that given the amount of problems that the Iranian regime causes all across the Middle East, given the threat it has created to the United States, the cost, the constant warfare, even if asymmetric, that it is engaged in against the United States for 46 years, that in the end it would be worth doing. And I think that's a fair argument. But let's recognize that the Iranians are most likely to do some of the most extreme things if they are fighting for the survival of the regime, again, exactly as General Benedict pointed out. And so regime change does carry both those sets of issues. One of the specific questions was about going after the supreme leader, as the president suggested. I find it very, very difficult to know what President Trump is thinking at any moment of time. I think that he was simply trying to create a threat to gain leverage with the Iranians. I can't be certain of that. Obviously, if the United States were to try to kill him, the Iranians would regard that as a deliberate attempt at regime change. And again, all bets are off. I think you'd see a very big set of responses from the Iranians to try to stay alive, stay in power. If we did take him out, this now then gets us into the realm of these regime change scenarios. And again, this is very, very unclear. It's to some extent like opening Pandora's box. You just don't know what is going to fly out. Iran experts, we've been thinking about what comes next for decades. None of us can say with great certainty anything. There are scenarios in which this regime stays in power even without Khamenei, or even if a lot of its leaders get killed, it hangs on because it does have some degree of public support. And the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, all of the instruments of internal control of this regime are very formidable. And, we've seen the Iranian people try to revolt against this regime every 2 to 4 years since 1999. And they've never been able to succeed. And again, hard to know. We don't get great numbers on, or accurate numbers on, Iranian public opinion, but it does seem like a huge number of Iranians want this regime gone. These protests get bigger and bigger, and yet they're never able to get rid of this regime. If the regime were to collapse, then it's a big question mark who comes to power in their wake. There's a very real prospect. In fact, I would say it's maybe the most likely scenario would be that if this regime collapses, you would have a period of chaos in Iran. You could have civil war, you could have all kinds of infighting. It could very well look like Lebanon, like Syria, like a whole variety of other places where we've seen the government collapse and descend into all kinds of fratricidal conflict. I think from an Israeli perspective, that would be much better than current circumstances, right? From an American perspective, it could be or it may not be. Certainly getting rid of this regime, I think, would be very beneficial to the United States. But, as we saw in Iraq after the fall of Saddam, while getting rid of Saddam was very beneficial to the United States, creating chaos in Iraq, civil war with all of the attendant spillover on neighboring states, created its own problems for the United States. And so we'd want to be thinking about that as well. And as I said, this is a very big question mark around regime change. As it for the Israelis, I think it's an easier one. I think their feeling is it's almost certainly going to be a net positive for them because they can't imagine an Iranian regime being worse for them, more determined to attack them than this one. From the United States perspective and the perspective of our other allies, it may be much more of a mixed bag. All right. I'd like to come back and ask ask Colby another question about Iran, which is play this out. A couple of questions along these lines. Play out the impact of this war as best you can on Iranian oil over the long term. What's your sense of what this means for Iranian oil exports, sanctions, all of those different things? To the extent you can speculate, Colby, is that we're getting several different questions about this. But what does this look like for Iranian oil after the war, whenever that is?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that makes the long view on Iranian supply difficult to begin with has been that it's been sanctioned for so long, and that you can estimate where supply will come from based on ongoing projects and based on a balance with where you expect demand to go. But you can't model out sanctions or a nuclear agreement in that same way, obviously. So the qualitative aspect there, I think, makes it a little more difficult and has for a long time. That being said, if you were to have a situation where there is some kind of an agreement and the sanctions that have really limited Iran's oil exports to the Chinese teapots alone were to be rolled back, then you could potentially see a situation where there would be more of an interest in international investment in Iran, and that could grow their capacity. The thinking now is that they can max out their production at around 3.8 million barrels per day, and exports would probably be maxed out, at fairly close to where they are now, probably a little higher. But a lot of that is going to depend on a factor that I just mentioned, which is the appetite for international investment in Iran. Before the war started, the thinking was that even if there were a nuclear agreement and the sector were to open up, and Iran's national oil company had looked like they were sort of positioning themselves to maybe even go on a roadshow for that before. It probably wouldn't be very likely that Western companies, certainly not American companies, would really want to touch it again. I mean, Total Energies has had to pull out of the South Pars gas project twice. But the issue there would really be getting that investment, and would they try to raise their capacity and kind of play this same long-term last man standing game that a lot of the other Gulf states are playing right now. The difficulty, I think, would be that if you see some form of state collapse in Iran, that you'd probably have the downside scenario where production could get really limited, depending on the actual conflict's impact on the sector itself, the availability of manpower to keep it working. I mean, the Iranian oil sector is massive. Its labor force requirements are pretty high. And so you could see something where the production would drop off as a result of that. That said, there are a lot of countries around the world that have been in a state of civil war for some time, where the oil sector has been remarkably resilient, and you do continue to get supply from those places. So I don't think that you could say that just because Iran would become very unstable internally, if that were to be the outcome, that we'd necessarily lose all supply from Iran. I think that would be hyperbolic in that kind of a situation. And I'll close with this, because as I think I mentioned, I have to jump for yet another session fairly soon. But the longer view there, I think, is that whatever the outcome is, Iran will definitely want to try and get as many barrels back to market as quickly as it can, and monetize these resources as quickly as it can, because we are definitely looking towards the end of the decade, getting close to what a lot of people see as the potential for peak oil demand. And there's probably a very long plateau after that, where the world is still going to use a lot of oil, but when it gets to the point where it's no longer a growth game anymore, the Iranian sector has really fallen behind over the years due to the sanctions impact and everything else. And you compare it to where a lot of the other Gulf states are, they're light years behind. So the push to try and modernize the sector as quickly as possible, and increase market share to the greatest extent that they can, should definitely be the priority, because the time to continue growing after that will soon be running out.
That's great, Colby. And if I could ask you one more quick one before you go, which is, you made a really interesting point at the beginning about how the traders seem to have looked at the history of these kinds of crises, and that's one of the reasons why they've been actually quite restrained in thinking about price going forward. Just a quick one. Do you think if either the US gets involved or Iran goes after targets in the Gulf, right? In other words, something happens that's unexpected, that people aren't expecting, some significant escalation. Do you think that there could be an overreaction on the part of the traders as a result of having been quite calm going into this and suddenly getting wrong-footed by that?
Yeah, there absolutely could. There's always going to be a very sharp reaction to a black swan, and if that's what this ends up being, then sure, you could see a similar price spike to what you saw at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where we shoot above $120 per barrel. If there is an actual major supply disruption, it could be sustained there. I don't think that's imminent. That's a very extreme scenario, but yes, you could absolutely see that kind of upside reaction if people feel that they've slept on the risk.
Outstanding. Colby, thanks for joining us. I know you have to jump to another call. Thanks again.
Thanks again.
General, I've got a few here that I think you're really the best one to address. First one's a tough one, answer it as best you can, but we've got a number of questions from people about the current American force posture in the region, some of the augmentations that we've seen, right? There's an additional surface combatant that's being moved, another carrier is supposedly coming in. But the questions are basically along the lines of, do you have the sense that the U.S. has the force laydown that it would be looking for right now, especially if the United States did enter the conflict? And, in particular, because, the Houthis are still out there. And obviously, there's a pretty good chance that if the United States were to enter, we'd see the Houthis resume attacks as well. And so there could be a lot of activity in the Gulf, especially if the Iranians do decide to take action in the Strait, in the Gulf more broadly, plus potentially the Red Sea. How do you see the current force laydown?
It strikes me that there is sufficient combat power in the theater. I think the thing that we don't have is the large ground formations. But when you look at the number of naval vessels and the number of aircraft that are in the theater, I think that they've achieved what they're trying to achieve. The the thing about deterrence and deterring Iran from attacking U.S. interests, U.S. allies in the region, we have to hold something they value at risk. And I believe certainly the amount of force posture that is being moved into the theater, 2 aircraft carriers, multiple destroyers, some also down in the Red Sea, some in the Mediterranean. That's a significant amount of combat power that the U.S. and not to mention the Air Force moves and then also several tanker squadrons. It looks like they've been deployed as well to be put in position if needed. And I just pulled all that out of the Washington Post. But as I was thinking about how they were setting up and how things are moving, it looks sufficient to me. But the 3 elements of deterrence. So as I mentioned, you want to hold something of value at risk, and I think the 3 elements determine having the capability, communicating it, and then also the will to use it. There's no question that the United States has all three. It's got this capability is sufficient. We're communicating it by broadly reporting what we're putting into the theater and the purpose for that going in the theater. And I don't think anybody in the Middle East questions whether or not the United States has the will to employ force in our national interests.
That's great. Okay, another tough one for you. You were talking, especially in your opening remarks, but since then as well, about the kind of the degradation of Iranian defenses and military capability, and really interesting question about how much of that is because of the physical destruction, how much of that is because of the degradation of command and control. Do you have any sense of that, General? How much of this is about the loss of the commanders and perhaps communications nodes versus the physical destruction?
Well, I think it's a combination of all those things together, and that's why I said I think we're going to have a lot to learn from this. I mean, just like after the invasion of Iraq, what we thought we saw on TV was one thing, and then it turned out there was a whole host of actions that occurred in order to create those effects. And this is what I talk about when I talk about the defeat mechanisms of disruption or attrition. And disruption really goes after creating a series of dilemmas for your adversary, and they don't know which way to turn. And so this isn't what we see, and what we see in battle damage reporting is we see destruction, attrition. But what we're not seeing is all the disruption. We're not seeing all the chaos in the leadership, their inability to make decisions, not knowing who your boss is because there's a smoking hole where his office building used to be. Who do I take orders from? And particularly in a military like this, where it's not like the U.S. military where we have high degree of initiative, and if you don't get an opportunity to take a new set of orders, you execute the last orders violently. That isn't necessarily the same in these type of militaries where they're waiting to be told exactly what to do. And if the leadership is decapitated, that is incredibly disruptive. I mean, this goes all the way back to like Russian, deep strike theory in the 30s, before Stalin killed all of his generals. They were the leaders of this type of thinking, and then the Nazis and Blitzkrieg. And so any type of maneuver warfare, it's putting the enemy on the horns of a dilemma. And I think that's exactly what the Israelis have been able to do through a combination of means that we probably won't fully understand for a while.
Well, that takes us to the end of our time. I apologize we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but there's just way too much to talk about here. I do think that we've been able to address a lot of really important ones. I hope that all of you got something from this. I will also remind everyone we're actually going to do a special session of the MEI Thursday webinar tomorrow at 11 a.m. Washington time. We're going to have Iran expert Kareem Sajadpour and Israel expert Shira Efron on to talk about the current conflict, and that will be actually open to the public and on the record. And so it's something that we do not normally do. So you're welcome to join us tomorrow at 11. General Benedict, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for this. To everyone else, thank you for tuning in and look forward to seeing you at our next one.